Hi, Gender and Communication. Welcome to week 14. You are nearing the finish line in this class. There is a month left in this class, but there's only 2 weeks worth of content left. So there's this week we're studying gendered media, and next week we're studying gendered power and violence. And it's interesting that these two chapters come at the end. This is maybe the most fun chapter to me anyway. I really like this chapter. Media is how I got into communication studies, so I think that's why I enjoy this chapter so much. And then next week's chapter is definitely the most important chapter. It's the most weighty subject, and we'll get into that next week. But keep that in mind. 2 more content units, and then the following week, so the week before finals, that's when you're going to submit, like finish your research paper and then submit it. So you still have 3 more weeks to work on that. Depending on when you watch this video. And then the final week is finals, and you're just going to take your test. So we're nearing the finish line. Totally doable. Everybody's doing great in this class. Your discussions have been awesome, and there's 2 more discussions and those types of papers and stuff left to go, and then just the research paper and the midterm. It's the last midterm. It's not even really a final. So you're doing great. Keep up the good work. So this week, I already told you this is a fun topic, and at least I think it's fun. I think it's interesting to think about the kinds of effects that media has on us. So they talk about, there's one section in the text about how media use is gendered, because it is masculine communicators, predominantly men, like you could track this, tend to play certain types of games online. They tend to be more interested in reading the news, whereas females, on average, tend to use social media and stuff to communicate about what's going on in their lives and to stay connected with other people, which makes complete sense because that's exactly what we already know about these patterns. So they talk a little bit about that, and they're going to go into more detail. And then they also talk about the kinds of messages that we get from media. So media is odd in that it sends us messages and then it reflects the messages that it thinks we want to hear. Does that make sense? So it's like reflecting our culture, but it's also establishing our culture. It's part of our culture. And it's like impossible to pull those things apart. You can't do it. It's all embedded. And I think it's really important to read it through that lens to understand that media is largely a reflection of larger cultural values, but it also reinforces cultural values because we pick up these messages, and they're not generally explicit. Most of the time they're implicit, but we know by now, I hope, that you understand just because you didn't realize that you absorbed something doesn't mean you didn't, you still probably absorbed it, especially in the context of media. If you think about how much media is consumed, a whole bunch, especially way more than it was 50 years ago, and clearly more than it was 100 years ago. It's like from 0 to a huge amount. So just in terms of amount, over the course of a year or a lifetime or whatever, we really absorb a lot of these messages. And then to discuss what kinds of impacts that does have on the way people think about gender. So for this week's discussion board, you're going to look at these 2 videos together. They're just under 20 minutes. They're not too long. They're both pretty important, and they say some different things. And so I think that they're both really important to watch. This top one here is a pretty good TED Talk about how movies teach manhood. And part of why I included this one was so that, because a lot of the times the focus tends to get on how movies teach femininity, and I was like, well, this is a good point, they're also teaching manhood, and they're going to talk about some of those, or this gentleman talks about some really important and compelling themes. And then it also, frankly, we're going to talk about something similar or related next week, so it's a good setup for that. So this is kind of one part of the story, and then it's not polar opposite or anything, but it's just a different section of the story where the author, or not the author, this woman, Gina Davis, you might know who she is. She's an actress. She's been in a couple pretty famous movies, but she does a lot of work in women's representation in the media. And I don't mean like the way they're depicted necessarily, although a little bit there, but women are largely underrepresented in the media. I don't know where I added the extra syllable there. And like women are less likely to have speaking roles, they get less screen time, there's fewer female directors, lots and lots of stuff. And sure, that's improved over the course of time, but it's still pretty far behind what you would expect if you were going to expect like the playing field to be even. And I'll say that that's also true in terms of ethnic or cultural minorities. I tend to see in American media, predominantly people who are white, and anyone who doesn't fit that one specific category is less likely to be represented. Again, that's improved very slowly. In fact, I think that gap has probably been closed slower than the gap for females. And then people who are gay are part of the LGBTQ plus community. Also very underrepresented in the media, although that in the last 10 years has gone from like almost none to at least some. So much more common than it used to be. And you know, data is always a year or two behind depending on how you calculate it. But this is still this is a really useful topic. And then this this woman in the organization that she runs, they do a lot of work in media studies about how women are underrepresented and like trying to close that gap and stuff. Women also tend to make less money in the film industry. There's probably lots and lots of examples, but this is the one that just jumped to my head. You probably know what the X-Files is, even if you didn't watch it when you were a kid like me, because I watched it when I was a kid, so you probably didn't watch it when you watched it later or something. Because I'm older than most of you anyway. Maybe not all of you, but most of you. My point is that that show had 2 stars, and at the time, one of them, the David Duchovny, the male lead, made a lot more than Gillian Anderson, the female lead, and she kind of decided, I don't remember in what season it was, but she was like, I'm going to make as much as him, and you're going to pay, like, I'm carrying the show 50%, and you're going to pay me as much. And the producers didn't want to do that, and she was like, well, fine, I quit. Or I'll quit if you don't do that. And they didn't believe her. And then I think David Duchovny might have even said, I'm like, she should probably be making as much as me. And because the two of them, like, they didn't used to be friends, and then I think they became friends over the course of the show. And anyway, she was one of the first people to like break that story and break one of those barriers about women not getting paid as much, even though they were doing the exact same job. And the producers eventually caved and gave her the same salary that what he was making. And I always think that the interesting footnote of that story is that he ended up leaving the show, and she carried that show like a year or two all by herself. People were like, we don't need David Duchovny. Gillian Anderson on her own is just as entertaining. So it's just kind of an interesting story. And I think that would have happened in the 90s, so it's a little bit dated, but that stuff still happens today. So yeah, anyway, this is going to be a fun chapter. When you get to this discussion, you'll see that you're going to read those, watch those videos, and you're going to answer some questions. And again, you get some choice about which questions you're going to answer because, frankly, I just think it's more interesting that way. Okay, well, have a great week. And as always, email me if you need anything.